The verse that we've been studying for the last several weeks is Luke chapter 9, verse 23. If you think you can say it with me, I invite you to say it together. Let's see if we can try it. If anyone would come after me, he must deny himself and take up his cross daily and follow me. Well, today we move to the last phrase of that verse. Follow me. And we're going to be looking in the coming weeks at what it means to follow Jesus wherever, whenever, and whatever. At first glance, when we read this invitation from Jesus, there's a tendency to see it as something rather poetic. But once you finally decide to step across the line and commit your life to following Jesus, it's important for you to understand and to think through the personal and practical implications that such a decision will have on your life. At the end of Luke chapter 9, after Jesus had offered his invitation to follow him, we're introduced to three individuals. All three seem eager to be a follower of Jesus. However, as they begin to process how following Jesus will impact their lives, they begin to make excuses. As they try to negotiate the terms of their commitment to Jesus, it becomes rather apparent that really these guys are nothing more than fans of Jesus rather than being a true follower of Jesus. The first fan that we meet is in verse 57 of Luke chapter 9. And here we find these words. As they were walking along the road, a man said to him, I will follow you wherever you go. Wow. I mean, just let those words sink in for a moment. They sound impressive. I mean, would you be willing today to say to Jesus, I will follow you wherever you go? Now, he seems to understand what Jesus is asking for and looking for. He knows the right words to say. If you've grown up in the church, you've learned a vernacular and a language that people outside the church are basically oblivious to. We sometimes call it Christianese. We know the right words to say. He states his commitment to Jesus. And he says all the right words. I will follow you wherever you go. And boy, that sure sounds like a follower to me. No restrictions, no boundaries, no borders, wherever. But look at verse 58. Jesus replies, foxes have holes, and birds of the air have nests, but the Son of Man has no place to lay his head. I mean, Jesus basically turns to this guy and says, hey, that's great. Glad you want to follow me and all, but you need to know right up front, I'm homeless. Now, my guess is that this disclosure probably was a deal breaker for a lot of would-be followers. And when this guy had said, I will follow you wherever, Jesus basically points to a place that will be a threat to his comforts and his security. And he asks, well, what about over there? Would you be willing to follow me over there? Luke doesn't specifically tell us the outcome, but we're kind of left with the impression that this guy basically said, did I say whatever? It was really just kind of a figure of speech. And figuratively speaking, I will follow you wherever, at least in spirit. It's much easier to speak about following Jesus when you just kind of make this big general statement without a specific commitment. But the most obvious and basic definition of following Jesus will mean that your willingness to follow him will require some significant life change. Following Jesus literally means that you will go where Jesus goes. And when you think of it in that way, suddenly those poetic words have some huge implications. Just like this first guy, we may be quick to say to Jesus, I'll follow you wherever, But I want to move it from the general to a bit more specific and see if any of this hits home with you. Where is the one place you find it most difficult to follow Jesus? I mean, just think about that for a bit. If you said to Jesus, wherever, where do you think is the one place he would point to and say, what about right there? What about in your own home? You may have no trouble carrying your cross throughout the day, but when you walk through the front door of your house, do you leave your cross on the front porch? For example, instead of submitting to one another in love, as the Scriptures command, do you insist on your own rights? Instead of serving, do you sit around? Instead of being patient, are you demanding? Instead of being encouraging, are you constantly critical? Instead of being a spiritual leader, are you passive and apathetic in your own home? What about there? And while we're on the subject of home, what about your extended family? Is there a relative that you're holding a grudge against? Someone in your family you haven't spoken to in years because of some past offense? Regardless of whose fault it is or was, your wherever may be Jesus asking you to lay aside the hurt of the past and be the bigger person and seek reconciliation. What about at work? At 9 o'clock in the morning during the week, you'll find a lot of fans getting out of their cars and saying to Jesus, why don't you just stay in the car? I'll be back around 5. When you clock into work, do you clock out of the following? Do you justify greed by calling it ambition? Do you rationalize dishonesty by calling it shrewd business principles? Do you remain quiet about your faith at work and call it being tolerant? What about at ball games? I used to be one of those fans. Yelling at the officials until I became one. Amazing how that changed your perspective. What about in your neighborhood? Or what about this? What if God points to a place like, let's say Burma, or Zimbabwe, or Mexico? What about there? Ann Judson was the wife of America's first foreign missionary, Adoniram Judson. Adoniram was 24 years old when he decided to leave America and sail to Burma. He was in love with Anne, who was 23 at the time. Burma didn't have a single missionary and was an extremely hostile environment. So Adoniram wanted to marry Anne before he moved to Burma and wanted her to go with him to spread the gospel there. Now, before he married Anne, he wrote her father the following letter asking for her hand in marriage. Now, to all you dads out there, especially you dads who have a daughter, Lord help me. Imagine how you would respond to receiving a letter like this. I have now to ask whether you can consent to part with your daughter early next spring to see her no more in this world. Whether you can consent to her departure and her subjection to the hardships and sufferings of missionary life. Whether you can consent to her exposure to the dangers of the ocean, to the fatal influence of the southern climate of India, to every kind of want and distress, to degradation, insult, persecution, and perhaps a violent death. Can you consent to all this for the sake of him who left his heavenly home and died for her and for you, for the sake of perishing immortal souls, for the sake of Zion and the glory of God? Can you consent to all this in hope of soon meeting your daughter in the world of glory with the crown of righteousness? Whew. What would you have done if you were her father? What would you have said? Her father told him that it was her decision to make. As Anne thought about this decision, she wrote the following note to her friend Lydia Kimball. She wrote, I feel willing and expect, if nothing in providence prevents, to spend my days in this world in heathen lands. Yes, Lydia, I have about come to the determination to give up all my comforts and enjoyments here, sacrifice my affection to relatives and friends, and go where God in His providence shall see fit to place me. Whew. That's what wherever looks like. So in 1813, think about that. A mere 33 years after the ending of the Revolutionary War, they left for Burma. They would experience one hardship after another. In 1824, Adoniram was put in prison. He was there for 18 months. At night, his feet were tied up and then hoisted into the air till only his shoulder and head rested on the ground. It was often 110 degrees and the mosquitoes would eat him alive at night. When he went to prison, Anne was pregnant. But she walked 2 miles every day to plead that he be released. After a year in prison, eating rotting food, Adoniram had wasted away. With hollow eyes and crippled from torture, during that time of incarceration, his daughter Maria was born. Anne was as sick and as thin as Adoniram. Her milk dried up. Mercifully, the jailer actually let Adoniram out of prison each evening so he could take the baby into the village and beg for women to nurse the baby. Eventually, he was released. But not long after that, Anne died at the age of 37 from spotted fever. However, because of Adoniram and Anne's efforts, the entire Bible was translated into Burmese. Today, there are over 3,700 congregations that all trace their beginning to when Adoniram and Ann Judson said to God, wherever. God pointed to Burma and He said, what about there? The man in Luke chapter 9 was happy to say wherever until God said, there. One of the main reasons we don't follow Jesus wherever is that when He says there, we take it more of as a suggestion rather than a command. Pastor Larry Osborne points out that in many areas of our lives, we treat God more like a consultant than we do as the Lord and Master of our lives. He said, now, a consultant is someone whose wisdom we highly value and listen to, but at the end of the day, we make the final decision. That's why they're called consultants. Here's the problem. God doesn't do consulting. Never has, never will. He does God. When we treat Him as a consultant, He simply stops showing up for the meetings. Jesus wants followers who will say yes to Him before they even know the request. I like that. A true follower of Jesus says, my answer is yes. Now where do you want me to go? What do you want me to do? Jesus may point to Burma, or He may start pointing across the street and says, what about there? The way Jesus answers this fan in Luke 9 reveals some of the reasons why it's so difficult to tell Jesus wherever. Jesus speaks of following Him as a journey filled with risk and uncertainty. If this guy does decide to follow Jesus, he doesn't have any idea where he'll be going or if he'll even have a place to stay when he gets there. So apparently he says no to following Jesus, in part because he's afraid of saying yes. Whenever we're afraid of what a commitment will lead to, the instinctual response is always no. Fear always asks the question, what if? What if I get married and he doesn't change? Or what if he does change? What if I take the job and it doesn't work out? What if I'm not successful? And this what if is what often concerns us about making a commitment to follow Jesus. What if He asks too much of me? What if He wants me to share my faith and He points to my neighbor's house? What if He wants me to adopt a child and He points to overseas? What if He wants me to reconcile with an estranged family member? Psychologists tell us that the number one way that people deal with fear is avoidance. We just go the other way, like Jonah. We just naturally stay away from the people and the places that cause us anxiety. The Old Testament prophet Jonah as I just alluded to, it says in chapter 1, verse 3, that Jonah ran away from the Lord. He was afraid that God would show mercy to the Ninevites. So he says, forget that. I'm going to go the opposite direction. Another reason this man in Luke seems to say no to Jesus is because Jesus calls him to something uncomfortable. As we learned last week with the Snuggie theology, we like our comfort. We do. If you say yes to Jesus, that I will follow you wherever, you can be sure that wherever He points will be out of your comfort zone. I can guarantee it. And out of your comfort zone can be defined in this way. Any place where saying yes to God means saying no to yourself. Sometimes it's not so much that we want to remain comfortable, it's just that our families will often push us toward being comfortable and living safe lives. They may be okay with you following Jesus, but they might have a hard time accepting it if Jesus asks you to go to a place that requires risk and sacrifice. Does this sound familiar to you? How can you take my grandkids so far away from me? As this man stands before Jesus and says wherever, I'm not sure he really understood what he was committing himself to. So Jesus puts a little skin on his words to help this guy see what the word wherever looks like. Jesus helps this guy understand that wherever may very well involve traveling from town to town while living as a homeless man on the street. I highly doubt that that was what this guy was thinking when he said to Jesus, I'll follow you wherever. You know, it kind of reminds me of the times when I've sat down with young couples before they get married. I do my best to give them that unedited version of marriage because a lot of them really have no idea what they're in for any more than you and I did before we got married. A lot of them kind of go into marriage with this kind of romantic fairy tale mindset without any idea of what they're committing to. And I do my best to paint a picture of what their vows, they say to each other, will look like after a year or so into their marriage. I sometimes like to say to the wife to be about a year into your marriage, you're going to be ready for bed and come into the family room and realize that your husband has gained 15 to 20 pounds. He's going to be sitting on the couch watching Sports Center and slurping down the last bit of a huge bowl of cereal. And between bites, he'll probably take that spoon and use it to scratch an itch on his back. Some of you are like, yeah. Then I'll turn around to the would-be husband and say, and about this time, she's going to start sounding a lot like your mother. Telling you, don't slurp your cereal, you need to eat at the counter or the table. And then you'll look at her and she'll even start to look like your mother. She'll be wearing the most modest nightgown ever made and have zit cream on her face. You know, it's like just inevitable. You see, I want them to understand what they're signing up for. And then I like to sometimes go through the traditional wedding vows, word for word, and paint a scenario of what those words actually mean. Because those words have huge implications. For instance, for better or for worse. Like when he gets that promotion, or when he gets fired, or when she finds out she's pregnant, or when she loses a baby. When you buy your first house, or when you can't sell your first house and the bank forecloses on it. For better or for worse. For richer or for poorer. When you got a little extra cash for a nice meal, or when you've eaten nothing but ramen noodles for the past 3 months. When you've saved enough to talk about retirement, or when you're overdrawn and the bills are due. In sickness and in health. When he's strong enough to carry you over the threshold. Or when he's older, incontinent, and needs to be pushed in a wheelchair. When she's young and energetic, or when she's older, tired, and showing the early signs of dementia. In sickness and in health. Now contrast this guy's response in Luke 9 with what we saw several weeks ago with Matthew. When Matthew decided to follow Jesus, he knew that it meant leaving everything behind. He knew he was walking away from a lucrative and comfortable existence to follow Jesus down a very uncertain path. In the New Testament, whenever a Talmud, a student, was finally accepted as a follower of a rabbi, he left his home, his job, and whatever else that might hold him back in order to follow that rabbi, quite literally everywhere he went. Wherever was not just a word used to express a commitment, wherever became a way of life. So if the rabbi decided to go to the market, guess what? His students went to the market. If the rabbi decided to go to another town, his students followed. If the rabbi needed to visit someone in the area who was sick, his students went with him. If the rabbi slept, his students slept. When the rabbi ate, his students ate. They were with him every step of every day. This idea of following a rabbi so closely is captured in a Jewish saying that has become quite popular in some Christian circles today. And that is, may you be covered in his dust. The most literal way to define a follower of Jesus is someone who goes where Jesus goes. I'm not sure how you can call yourself a follower of Jesus if you refuse to go where Jesus went. If you're following Jesus wherever, he will take you towards a sinner that no one else would want to be seen with. You may find yourself among people who are sick that others would try to avoid. If you follow Jesus, you can expect to find yourself being criticized by some of the religious people in your life. If you follow Jesus, you might even hear your family telling you that you're crazy, much like Jesus' family did him. You may even find yourself being unfairly treated and unjustly accused by those in influential positions or political office. Ultimately, if you follow Jesus wherever, you won't just end up covered in his dust. You'll be covered in his blood as well. In closing this morning, I want to read another not a fan story from Kyle Idleman's book. A young lady named Rachel Starr, who grew up in a Christian home. This story in particular hits home with me because of something that Emily and I experienced a few years ago at the International Convention of the Church of God in Anderson, Indiana, where we learned about a ministry that was happening right there in that county around Indianapolis and in Anderson. And she could tell you more about it than probably I could. But here's what Rachel said. I had never been in a strip club in my life. Hopefully none of you have either. But she said, I felt this calling from God to reach out to women in the sex industry. I didn't really know how I was going to do this, but I knew that God had given me a passion for these women to know how much he loves them and how precious they are in his eyes. Still, I was definitely nervous to share the idea with others. I mean, going to a strip club isn't exactly typical for a church-raised girl. But whatever my doubts, I knew God was calling me to take action. He wanted more out of me than just having feelings of compassion for women in the sex industry. He wanted me to do something about it. In 2008, I started Scarlet Hope, a ministry that reaches out to women involved in the sex industry. We take big Southern Comfort-style dinners to strip clubs. Our prayer is that we're not just feeding their stomachs, but that we're feeding a deeper spiritual hunger. In some clubs, we fix hair and makeup so we can get some one-on-one time with the girls. It gives us the opportunity to pray with women in the middle of a strip club. How often does that happen? Through this ministry, I've seen hearts changed and lives touched as many of these ladies have turned to Christ for forgiveness and a new beginning. Honestly, my heart and relationship with Jesus have also been drastically changed. I've even seen Jesus show up many times in the back of a strip club dressing room. Many dancers have opened up to us, sharing their struggles, asking for prayer, and some have even accepted our invitations to church. It's funny, but the dancers have taken to calling us the church ladies. I never thought I'd end up with such a traditional title doing such radical work for God, but I think that's the kind of church lady God was calling me to become. My name is Rachel Starr, and I am not a fan. Emily, what was the name of the organization? Stripped Love. And one of the things that was kind of interesting about that, as I recall, Jim Lyon, who was going to be our speaker during Summer Impact, this lady attended his church when he was pastoring there in Anderson, that started the organization there in Anderson. And if I recall, the ladies took like an offering to help with some expenses for some needy families in the church. So it's like, where does that come from? But they've rescued several ladies out of the sex trade, so to speak. It's just been remarkable, the turnaround there. The point of that whole story is this: is for you to look at your own life and ask yourself, am I merely a fan of Jesus? Or am I a follower? Are you willing to follow Jesus wherever? Let's pray. Father, I've known of stories and situations where people have felt a call from you to go wherever. But like Jonah, they turned and ran the other way. For some, it led to a life of misery and discontent. For others, at a point later in life, they returned and said yes. And to see how you were able to use their lives and bring about change through their obedience, it's remarkable. My prayer for each person here today is that as your Holy Spirit begins to speak to our hearts, that we could say yes before a request is even made. That we would be willing to follow you wherever you lead. That might require pulling up stakes, going to a place like Burma. It might just be walking across the road to a neighbor's house. It might be seeking reconciliation with a family member. Wherever you lead, may we be willing to say yes to you. So speak to our hearts today. Point us in the direction you would have us go. May we take up our cross and follow you. In Jesus' precious name I pray. Amen.